Greetings, fellow Sierra Leoneans. My name is Cherno Alphaba, and me na the editor-in-chief of the Africanist Press. Well, this na episode number 3 of our ongoing series, the New Democracy Project. Last week, we talked about the agreement for national unity, how the Tripartite Agreement now represent within the Constitution of Sierra Leone say. Well, today we want to expand on that conversation where we started last week for continuously show and remind Sierra Leoneans and say within the APC and SLPP they call an agreement for national unity is far from an agreement for national unity. As we've been on talk over the last 3 years, within the APC and SLPP do following the election of June 2023, the disputed election of June 2023, now the equivalent of a coup, an electoral coup, which means the APC and the SLPP agree for take over the governance institutions in Sierra Leone, within that means occupy parliament, the local government councils, and share cabinet positions among themselves without the production of a credible election result. So that process itself, not within the Constitution say. The Constitution of Sierra Leone and the public elections laws make them very clear, say nobody no go be a member of parliament, a councillor, a mayor, a president without the conduct of a free and fair election. We don't even cite an example of the provision within the Public Elections Act of 2022 which show how a credible election should be organized. Today we want for continuously emphasize this point because we believe, say, you no go talk about democracy, you no go talk about good governance in any country whose side the rule of law has been overthrown, whose side politicians and political parties and governance institutions decide for carry on governance without respect for the Constitution and the rule of law. So last week, as we've been talking about, say, tripartite agreements not represent democracy, that democracy is never done through a tripartite agreement. We want for continuously talk about that point and for emphasize, say, what we call the tripartite agreement in Sierra Leone is not just an illegal arrangement between the SLPP and the APC, but also an agreement endorsed and supervised and supported by foreign organizations and representatives of foreign governments, foreign embassies in Sierra Leone for create what we call a triangle of illegality. Following the disputed elections, the APC and SLPP go into a meeting in a hotel in Freetown for 3 days. This was in October 2023, and come up with an agreement where allow them for take over governance institutions, the legislative arm of government, and the rest of the other governing institutions, and distribute power amongst themselves and carry on governing without respect for the law. And unfortunately, this arrangement will violate the Constitution and the public elections laws was supported, mediated, and financed by foreign organizations, in this case, United Nations, the Commonwealth, the European Union representatives, the African Union, backed by foreign embassies in the country for allow the APC and SLPP for create what they call a shared government so that they will carry on governing and disregard the actual mandate of the people. We've had an illegal arrangement, an illegal regime made up of APC and SLPP politicians for 3 years now, where this then call them the result of a tripartite agreement. Today we want to talk about this because we want for sure say what we call tripartite is not just an undemocratic arrangement, it's not just a violation of the Constitution of Sierra Leone or a violation of the public elections laws, but through the involvement of the international, what we call international community or so-called moral guarantors, we don't get in Sierra Leone what we call a triangle of illegality. Now that's not the tripartite. Tripartite means an agreement made up between 3 parties. On one side of the triangle, na the APC. On the other side of the triangle, na the SLPP. And on the middle side of that triangle, na the so-called moral guarantors were made up of foreign organizations and foreign embassies, representatives of foreign governments stationed in Sierra Leone, who decided that because the elections of June 2023 were not credible, were not transparent, were not held based on the constitution and the public election law, then for just allow 2 out of the 13 political parties, the APC and SLPP, for govern the country disregarding the constitution. And then do that on the so-called notion that that is the only way, then go maintain unity, peace, and allow the country to go on. You cannot sacrifice constitutionality, legality in the so-called effort for maintain peace. If you call that peace, now a class peace, what we call a peace between the APC and SLPP politicians, not a peace whether in the interest of the country, whether in the interest of national unity, is a unity of the APC and the SLPP politicians against the national interest, against the interest of the people of Sierra Leone, who come out in thousands and millions for vote, only to have their votes not properly counted, not tabulated, not accounted for up to today. So we want to spend some time for talk about what are the implication of this shortcut, this illegal shortcut, this circumvention of the constitution, this deliberate effort by international organizations, foreign embassies, people who call themselves friends of Sierra Leone, for allow 2 of the political parties that have dominated the political landscape of Sierra Leone for 65 years now, for carry on commandeering state institutions, commandeering the national treasury, distributing power, distributing public resources amongst themselves without a clear electoral mandate. What are the implications of this kind of situation for the democratic dispensation of the country and for the future of credible elections? Well, as we begin this conversation, the last 2 weeks, significant developments don't take place in Sierra Leone, as we all know. First and foremost, the APC claimed after 3 years of being in this illegal arrangement that they don't boycott parliament and they don't boycott the local councils on the notion that the SLPP is not committed to maintaining this their own side of the triangle of illegality. So what does that mean? That means, say, the politics of rotation, we don't allow the APC and SLPP for preside over governance, regardless of the choices of the people. When Tijan Kabaka may do 10 years, and Eskromaka may do 10 years, then now Madabio again, the APC allow them for do 10 years with the hope that by 2020, regardless of what the decision is, APC politicians think it's their own turn to come to power, then believe, say, that agreement in their own thinking and in their own voice is not being honored or respected by Madabio and SLPP, and this is why they've decided to boycott parliament. So we come out and say the APC is as guilty as the SLPP because they are all beneficiaries of the illegal conduct of election, the violation of the constitution of June 2023 will lead to the creation of an illegal regime made up of the 2 parties. So following this conversation, the APC again come out and say an agreement has been reached again between the 2 parties, SLPP and APC, supervised by the same so-called moral guarantors. This triangle, these organizations, 3 organizations or 3 set of entities will create this triangle of illegality for the last 3 years in the country for broker peace, for make sure, say, the APC return to parliament, return to the council, and continue to participate in the illegal arrangement that has been in place, that has been imposed on the country, leading up to the next 2 years, we will get a new, suppose, another election. So in other words, we don't get a situation where a drama has happened in the country, where the 2 parties that are part of this triangle of illegality claimed the agreement is falling apart. They are so-called moral guarantors, representatives of these foreign organizations who help to impose this illegal regime on the people of Sierra Leone, come together again and say, then for revise the agreement. They don't make revisions, suppose revisions to the agreement, and add new things and suggest ways that this so-called tripartite agreement, which we call the triangle of illegality, will be maintained and protected leading up to the next election. We're going to ensure that the politics of rotation between the APC and SLPP continue. But in order for us to go into this and show exactly the implication, the illegality, and its long-term effects on the democratization process in Sierra Leone, the rule of law, constitutionalism, and multi-party politics, and also for sanitized electoral environment, we need for first and foremost go back to what they actually call an agreement of national unity, the actual agreement where these people signed in October 2023 will lead up to the creation of this shared government between the APC and the SLPP, and examine what really they may agree on in October 2023, where they say they don't fall apart, and then come back to this so-called new agreement where they don't revise and see whether they are different or what we don't witness now, a perfection of the illegality that was created subsequent to their meeting in October 2023. Now that we want to talk about. But above all that, before we come to these details and analyze these two documents and see the nature of the illegality and its implication, we want to remind Sierra Leoneans and say on Sunday, now the 65th anniversary of what they call independence in Sierra Leone. What does that mean? Now the day when the British decide for transfer power over to local politicians. At the time of this transition, both the politicians of the APC and the SLPP had formed a united front, a coalition for create what they call a single monolithic government. In other words, a united front for so-called independence with Milty Magai as the leader. But on the eve of independence, that was when the politicians who formed the APC decided to create what they call the election before independence movement, will lead to what we now get as an APC. So in other words, what we call APC as a party is a breakaway faction of the SLPP. Now that we want for underline. So what we've had since 1961 to the present day has been these two factions of the same class of individuals divided into two entities called political parties who've been governing the country. And all the dispute we don't get, all the crisis and conflict, whether in a military coup, whether in a what you call the civil war, the corruption, underdevelopment, is a shared responsibility of the politicians who make up these two factions, the APC and the SLPP. And this ongoing drama, we don't rob we of the required national unity, of the required peace, and the harmony that we need for help advance the country, has been the responsibility of these politicians. This conversation that we've been having and what the elections of 2023 provide us is an opportunity for make we go back and examine where did we go wrong, how we go able create a real multi-party environment where the people of Sierra Leone will have the undeniable right, the inviolable right for decide for themselves the kind of government, the kind of entity that should spearhead or create the kind of country that we imagine. Not all of us are APC or SLPP, and impossible for me we all be APC and SLPP, because we've come to see historically and in the present, and even as we move into the future, we don't say there is more than enough evidence. We don't show we say the APC and SLPP cannot deliver to the people of Sierra Leone today as they have never done in the past, neither in the near future or in the long-term future, the kind of country that we want. And what is that country? Where a man and a woman, everybody, will be guaranteed of safety, of the ability to use their potential, both locally and internationally, and the kind of country that we need as human beings. That unity what we need for move the country forward, for realize the purposes of our own existence, cannot be guaranteed by the APC and SLPP. It's taken us 65 years. We get enough evidence, both in the past and in the present, and even in their own program, we should say, we got to move on from one abysmal situation to another. So as they get this conversation, we want to remind the people, say, it's now time for we talk about not just this illegal arrangement that has been imposed on the people, but also an opportunity for talk about what is the solution out of this kind of situation. So we'll take a break now. When we come back after the break, we will talk about this illegal arrangement that has been imposed on us following the elections of June 2023. Well, before the break, we talk about the nature of the Tripartite Agreement, which we call the Triangle of Illegality, and how the agreement between the APC and SLPP, when they call Agreement for National Unity, is not an agreement for national unity. Because an agreement between the APC and the SLPP, we have to underline that, an agreement for national unity will have included each and every political party will participate in the elections. In June 2023, we had 13 political parties that participated in the election. Following the dispute, the failure of the Electoral Commission of Sierra Leone for organized, transparent, and democratic elections as required by the Constitution of Sierra Leone and the public election laws, the APC say they're not going to participate in governance, then boycott parliament. They were not the only political party that contested the elections. In fact, few weeks before the election, the Commonwealth Secretariat make all the political parties, 13 political parties and their leaders who were contesting the elections, signed what they call a memorandum of understanding where submit them to peace, where all 13 political parties committed themselves to upholding the laws governing the free, fair, and transparent and peaceful elections. In other words, each political party and political leader who had registered as a candidate or as a contestant in the elections of June 2023 committed on paper that they were going to respect the laws governing the conduct of elections. This agreement was signed in front of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth Secretariat led that process. Now, during the election, that agreement was violated because the elections were not peaceful, they were violent, they were not free from violence, they were not transparent, they were not held according to the rules governing the free and fair conduct of elections as required by the Constitution and the public election laws. So what happened following the disputed elections? The Commonwealth, the United Nations, African Union, in other words, foreign organizations, decided to constitute a committee that traveled to Freetown in October 2023 and called the APC and the SLPP into a hotel. They held a meeting at the Bintumani Hotel in Freetown for talk about a solution to the disputed election. What did the law say regarding a disputed election? It called for the nullification of the elections. If these international organizations were serious about democracy, about respecting the rule of law, they will have followed what the law says. What did the law say? Both the Constitution and the Public Election Act prescribe exactly how a presidential, parliamentary, local government election should be held in Sierra Leone. Any violation of that law by any individual or organization get penalties. As we said last week or 2 weeks ago, that one prescribed punishment will have been for the Chief Electoral Commissioner and all the commissioners who presided over the election should have been in prison if it was proven, as we have seen, that they violated the law. They deliberately failed to follow the law when they organized the election of June 2023. But what happened? Both the international organizations will go for mediate and look into this election, just decided to call 2 of the contesting parties out of 13 political parties to a meeting. So which means they were very selective. They not even call all the parties that contested the election. They just decided that the APC and the SLPP are the 2 dominant parties. They've been the 2 parties that have dominated the political landscape of Sierra Leone since 1961. So as a virtue of that, those were the only 2 parties that should be called into a meeting. So right there, the organizations that mediated, the so-called international mediators, lost their credibility because they were not neutral. They failed to include, they were not inclusive in their negotiations. They selected only 2 parties, SLPP, that was the incumbent party when the election was organized, and the APC, that in their mind was the dominant or the major opposition party in the country, and called them into a meeting to decide what is the way forward. So what did they do? They came up following 3 days of meeting that was held between the 16th to the 18th of October 2023 at the Bintumani Hotel. They came up with a document called an Agreement for National Unity. So you don't see the right there, the deception. How can you have 13 political parties contesting an election, the elections are disputed, and then you decide to hold a meeting between 2 parties only, excluding 11 other political parties? And each of these parties, whether they are small or big in your own mind, they are all the same when it comes to the election. They should be treated equally because they all represented and fulfill the same criteria to contest the election. And there are no results in the first place. The elections have been disputed. So in a dispute, you have to invite all the contending parties. So the criteria used to select the APC and the SLPP in itself excluded the majority of the other parties. So right there, the so-called international organizations that are referred to as international moral guarantors lost their own morality. They do not even deserve the title moral guarantors because they were exclusive from the beginning. So what did they say? Following 3 days of meeting, welcoming the 3-day mediated dialogue between the government of Sierra Leone. At this point, there was no government in the first place because the SLPP, that was the governing party, its mandate had expired in June 2023 when the elections were held. So what they are calling government here is the SLPP. So following 3 days of meeting between the SLPP and the All People's Congress APC party, here to refer to as the parties. So in their own mind, only these 2 parties deserve to be called into a meeting to address the political impasse post the June 24, 2023 multi-tier elections. How can you address an election, the impasse that resulted from the election, and you invite only 2 parties into a meeting, excluding 11 other parties? So you see, this is where they lost their neutrality. So taking the mediators of the dialogue, the African Union, the Economic Committee of West African States, the Commonwealth, and the Independent Commission for Peace and National Cohesion for their efforts to bring the parties together. So they were thanking themselves for bringing the parties together. Meanwhile, it's only 2 parties, excluding 13 parties. So they never brought the 2 parties together. So these are the preamble of the document. But what did they agree? I'm not going to read them all for the sake of time, but the parties resolved the following. In other words, after these 3 days of meeting between the APC and the SLPP and these international representatives of these international organizations that included the African Union, ECOWAS, the Commonwealth, and the Independent Commission for Peace and National Cohesion, they resolved the following. 1, that Madabio, who is the leader or the candidate, the presidential candidate of the APC, should address the country, should issue out a statement, a national statement on dialogue, unity, cohesion, and peace. Meanwhile, Madabio had been declared president or winner of the election without the production of election results. So in other words, they agreed that they recognized him as the president without the election. That 2, the APC should end its non-participation in governance, that the APC should go should participate in the government. The APC and the SLPP should constitute a government. And that the president, in other words, Madabio, in consultation with the APC party, should constitute a cross-party committee on electoral systems and management bodies review with a three-way leadership nominated by the SLPP, the APC, and the development partners. Development partners here, they're referring to international organizations, the United Nations, the foreign embassies in the country, ECOWAS, and other people. So they agreed that the APC and the SLPP should form a government and that a committee that will look into the election should be constituted. That committee should be made up of SLPP and APC, and whosoever is selected by these international mediators who have decided that the other 11 parties should not be invited into this dialogue or into this committee. So I will not read all of the points, but what we have here is 8 points that were agreed on. And then the 4th point is that the parties to the dialogue agree to the following: that they should release of any persons arrested, detained, and or imprisoned for alleged elections and civil protest. And this should also include informed by a list to be submitted by the APC. In other words, if people were arrested for violence or for any other crime leading up to the election, the APC should provide a list of their detained people that will be released. Secondly, the discontinuation of any politically motivated court cases against the APC and their supporters. And this also should be based on a list submitted, that the APC should submit a list to the government for any of their candidates or individuals who are in court on charges, whatever charges that they were accused of, they should be released. So both parties agree to the institutionalization of an inter-party dialogue framework between the APC and the SLPP. This will be facilitated by the government. Both parties commit to re-engineer and rekindle the relationship within the national socio-political ecosystem. But most importantly is point 7 and point 8, where it says the SLPP and the APC party jointly should condemn all citizens at home and abroad who incite violence, spread hate speech, and disrupt national cohesion, online and offline, and they will continue all efforts to bring those individuals or those involved in carrying out what they refer to as hate speech to justice. So after agreeing that they should constitute government regardless of the disputed election, without the production, without the audit of the election, and without the publishing and verification of the elections, without investigating the actual dispute that led to the election, the APC and SLPP politicians should occupy parliament, cabinet. There should be a shared government between the two parties. Both parties now agree that any individual that they believe is engaged in any activities that constitute in their own definition hate speech. So put simple, anyone that is opposed to this arrangement will be considered someone that is against national unity or peace. And both parties agree that they will pursue those individuals and bring them to justice. In other words, people like us who are saying that constitutionalism, the rule of law, the Public Elections Act, the Constitution must be respected, and that those who are responsible for violating the mandate of the people, for stealing the votes of the people, should be investigated and prosecuted. We will be considered as individuals who are spreading hate speech, who are against national unity. And in other words, both parties should pursue actions to bring us to justice for standing on the side of the Constitution and the rule of law. And that is what they've been doing. For the last 3 years, APC and SLPP politicians have been hounding and harassing and suppressing and paying even foreign agents to harass us. We have the evidence. We're going to come to that in future episodes. But we just want to make una know, say, in October 2023, the APC and the SLPP, together with international organizations, decided to disregard the elections, the votes of the people that were stolen, and authorized the APC and SLPP to constitute government without respect for the Constitution and the rule of law. This is why we say the agreement for national unity is nothing but an illegal agreement. It's a triangle of illegality. Those who came to negotiate, to help Sierra Leoneans to figure out how to maintain the rule of law and respect their own constitution, decided to take sides with the APC and SLPP, and went into a hotel and came out following 3 days of meeting in October 2023 and imposed on the country a government that is not the result of the elections. They violated the sovereignty of the people, national sovereignty. There is nowhere in the world, imagine an election held in the UK or held in any part of Europe or United States, and then somebody tell the people of the UK, the British citizens, that forget about your votes, you have to constitute a government based on a hotel agreement. Or you tell that to American voters or to European voters. They're not going to accept that. When people go to vote, the votes have to be counted. The result of the votes have to be properly certified. Any individual who will emerge as a leader or a representative of from that election has to be the result of the votes of the people. that is not what happened in Sierra Leone. The elections, people came out to vote. The elections were disputed. Local and international observers condemned the non-transparent nature of the elections. In other words, the elections failed to meet any standard of a democratic election. And now we have international organizations coming in to mediate that dispute. Instead of investigating the elections and producing the election results or nullifying the results if they were not transparent and reorganizing a new election, they asked the APC and SLPP to constitute a government and carry on governing. And not only that, made up an agreement and provided in point 7 of that agreement that they will also prosecute anyone who is against such an arrangement. That if we oppose this arrangement, we will be considered as individuals who are engaged in hate speech. So those of us who support the Constitution of Sierra Leone, who are insisting that public election laws should be upheld, should be respected, the Constitution has to be respected, are now considered as people who are against the peace of the country and the stability of the country. I mean, you cannot get gangsterism more than that. So this is the reason why we say the Agreement of National Unity did not only violate the Constitution, but it imposed an illegal regime on the country, and we've been living under a triangle of illegality in Sierra Leone for the last 3 years. Now, what will happen 3 years later as we continue to experience this deceptive arrangement, this arrangement of destruction, undemocratic arrangement? The APC and SLPP claim they are now in dispute. And the same foreign organizations came again, and now after having realized that they actually made up an error, now they came up again with another revised agreement. A revised agreement for address some of these illegality. They made up 10-point agreement. I will read that 10-point agreement there again for sure exactly how this illegality, they try to sanitize this illegality. I'm not going to read all the 8 points, but I will show how both parties are now realizing that agreement. What did I say now? Point 1, the government, that they have to engage the leadership of parliament to urgently constitute a parliamentary standing committee, electoral matters. But that is not the point. Now they are saying that on national peace and election management, parties were informed, blah, 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 but the most important part, they are now calling for a broadening of the so-called agreement of national unity. Now having realized 3 years later that they were wrong to bring the APC and the SLPP only into dialogue and allow them to commandeer institutions of governance and carrying on with this illegality for 3 years, they are now asking that this mediated dialogue between the two parties should now they should now broaden it to include other political parties and other voices. So, in other words, those who constituted the triangle of illegality have realized that they were wrong, but this realization came 3 years after the continuation of this illegality. So I'm not going to read all the points them now, but in the revised points, which are not really different from the first agreement, but the most important part for our own purposes here, especially for today's discussion, now point 1, where they've said the government, in other words, me no go read as government, we say the SLPP to engage the leadership of parliament to urgently constitute the parliamentary standing committee on electoral matters in the spirit of the agreement for national unity, specifically recommendation 20 of the tripartite report. So what did they call for? That restructure and expand the implementation framework of the agreement of national unity and the tripartite recommendations through revised terms of reference that include A, the establishment of a high-level oversight mechanism with a mandate to provide strategic oversight of the tripartite steering committee. B, the expansion of the tripartite steering committee to include additional APC members and other voices currently excluded, namely other political parties and civil society, to ensure inclusion. That essentially don't say what we talk about. When they met in October 2023, this is how they will have started. What you never don't start with, then can with last. You cannot call for a national conversation to remedy a national political problem arising from the conduct of a national election and decide to convene a meeting of 2 of the contesting parties, excluding 11 political parties and other organizations across the country. We pointed it out in 2023 that what the so-called moral guarantors and the APC and SLPP have imposed on the country is an illegal regime. They have just endorsed the electoral coup of June 2023. 3 years later, they came back into the country and now are suggesting that this illegal arrangement that was imposed on the country in October 2023 following the Bintumani Hotel Agreement, the 3 days of meeting in Bintumani between the APC, the SLPP, and this host of foreign organizations should now be expanded to include, in their own thinking, additional APC members and other voices currently excluded, namely other political parties and civil society to ensure inclusion. That says it all. Now they realize they excluded the majority of, you have 13 parties, you select only 2, which means you excluded the majority of the contesting parties. That means you excluded the majority of Sierra Leoneans. So the so-called agreement of national unity was not an agreement of national unity. It was an agreement between the 2 dominant factions that have dominated the political landscape of Sierra Leone for the last 65 years, the APC and the SLPP. Unfortunately, that illegal arrangement was endorsed by international organizations. That's why it's called tripartite. Tripartite means 3 sides to the agreement. On the one side is foreign organizations, the Commonwealth, the AU, the ECOWAS, backed or financed by the United Nations and foreign embassies. And on the other side of that agreement, that triangular relationship, that tripartite relationship, is the SLPP. And on the third side is the APC. The consequence of that is the creation of an illegal regime made up of politicians from both parties who took over seats in parliament, in the councils, calling themselves members of parliament, councillors and mayors, and cabinet ministers and the president without a properly conducted election, without an electoral mandate. Their mandate came from an illegal arrangement resulting from a 3 days of meeting that was held in October, from October 16 to the 18th, 2023. What it did was to exclude majority of Sierra Leoneans. Democracy is for the majority. So we had a minority arrangement backed by international organizations that imposed an illegal regime on the people of Sierra Leone for the last 3 years. 3 years later, the 3 parties to this illegal arrangement came back and realized they've excluded the majority of voices and now are calling for the incorporation of those they marginalize into this arrangement. That include many of us who have insisted 2 years before the election, who showed evidence 2 years before the election that both parties had agreed to rig the election in favor of Madabio because in 2028 they had an arrangement that the APC, the SLPP was going to turn power over to the APC. We called it the 2028 agenda of the opposition. Now 2 years to that election, the APC feared that Madabio is not going to honor that arrangement. This is why they walked out of parliament. And now they've been assured that that agreement, the politics of rotation, is going to be respected. That regardless of whether you come out to vote in 2028 or not, the APC has the belief, based on this arrangement, that they are going to constitute the next government. We do not have a democracy. Unfortunately, 65 years after the so-called transition to what you call independence, indigenous self-government, we still have an arrangement where power is being rotated between the APC and the SLPP. And that is not democracy. That is a clear case of an imposition that is against the will of the people. So 65 years later, our search for democracy and multi-party politics and a multi-party environment continues. So we want to stop here for this week. Until next week, we will continue this conversation. You've been listening to The Voice from Exile with me, Cherno Alpha Emba. See you next week.
You have been listening to the Africanist Press podcast service's New Democracy Project, sponsored by Northwestern University's Program of African Studies. Tune in for special commentary and interviews every Sunday for free on Spotify, WhatsApp, Telegram, YouTube, Radio Public, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and other podcast platforms. You can help spread our message by sharing our podcasts with your friends and family. And see you next week.